Hello and welcome to this tutorial on the RFT CBS framework focused on the overarching strategy of psychotherapy. So this tutorial is adapted from the third part of Chapter 3 in Mastering the Clinical Conversation, Language as Intervention. You can find other resources on the clinical applications of RFT at languageasintervention.com. In this tutorial, you will learn about how therapists can alter the context to transform symbolic functions. So let's first quickly refresh our memory by reviewing the overarching goals of therapy based on CBS and RFT. Flexible context sensitivity is the capacity to notice various features of the context and to respond to what is most relevant. And functional coherence is a way of thinking that is primarily guided by the impact that our ideas have on our experience. We used the metaphor of building a jigsaw before, in order to better grasp what these two overarching goals are about. So flexible context sensitivity is like observing the pieces, looking at their shapes and colors, and functional coherence is like making the pieces fit together based on the jigsaw we want to build. So now the question we need to answer is how to reach these overarching goals. Or said another way, how we can shape flexible context sensitivity and functional coherence in therapy based on CBS and RFT. The answer is relatively simple and shouldn't surprise you at this point. Our overarching strategy is to transform symbolic functions by altering the context. So a funny example of this process can be found in this painting by Jean Dubuffet, which is a highly valued piece of art and is probably worth millions of dollars. Many of us, to be honest, might not see its value if the picture was on a fridge like a child's drawing. The context changes, and the symbolic function changes too. Notice that we didn't change the picture per se, but the context surrounding it. This approach is particularly useful when dealing with psychological experiences because, as we saw before, we can't remove or replace them like light bulbs. We have to learn to relate to them in a different way. Transforming a symbolic function doesn't mean we remove any previous function. We can add a new function, select an existing function, or augment an existing function. In a previous tutorial, we played a game together consisting of finding all kinds of ways we can use a spoon. In that process, we contacted functions that we already knew, like eating with a spoon, but we also created new ones, some that you had probably never thought of, like spreading butter on a toast. If you spread butter with a spoon, it doesn't mean that the function of eating with it has disappeared. Based on the context, some functions are just more salient, more visible. So let's bring the idea of transforming functions to the context of clinical work. When they come to therapy, our clients are generally engaged in behaviors that are not effective at building and sustaining a meaningful, satisfying life. These behaviors are influenced by the context, which includes a number of psychological experiences and external events that can be removed or physically changed. When the elements of the context that influence clinically relevant behaviors can be physically changed or removed, what we can do instead is change their symbolic functions, which means changing the way the client conceptualizes or interprets these elements. So let's look at a concrete example. A client says, "It's too scary. I think it's better that I don't go there." So he's verbalizing a thought he's having, which describes feelings and states a rule. We don't know exactly what this is about, but we can imagine that the client is seeing an emotion as a barrier to action, and that the best thing to do is to not do this action. So, if we imagine that this action is something the client cares about, it might be helpful to increase contact with what is important about it. In other words, we could transform the function of not going there so that instead of being the best thing to do, it might become more desirable. For example, the therapist might ask, "What will you miss if you don't go there?" This way, the therapist brings the client's attention to functions that are overlooked at the moment and might be useful. So if the client responded, "I won't be able to see my kids," then it's a sign that he's in touch with a new function. Not going there as a new function. Or perhaps a former function is being selected and augmented in this moment. In order to transform functions, we need to alter the context. As we saw in previous tutorials, Most of what happens in terms of alteration of the context in psychotherapy happens through language. Remember that language is not just words and sentences, but anything that participates in symbolic networks like gestures, postures, facial expressions, and even silences if they carry some meaning, which is often the case. If we continue with our clinical example, we could explore different ways the therapist might alter the context to transform the function of not going there. As we said earlier, he might ask, "What will you miss if you don't go there?" which brings the consequence of not going there into the symbolic context, perhaps in terms of values. He could also ask, "What do you notice in your body as you're having that thought?" which will help the client conceptualize his experience as a thought and maybe decrease its influence on his behavior. It would also orient the client's attention to his sensation, which might help him recognize antecedents that tend to trigger ineffective responses. The therapist could also ask, "If your best friend told you what you just said, what would you advise him to do?" which would bring a different perspective to the context and perhaps help him consider different responses to the thought of not going there. Or he could ask, "What happens when you have this kind of thoughts and you avoid activities you care about?" which would bring the context the consequence of avoiding activities he cares about. The function of not going there might be transformed such that instead of being the best thing to do, it becomes an ineffective response to the eyes of the client. So, all these examples are instances of alteration of the context. At each moment, there is an infinite number of ways we can alter the context. Knowing a variety of therapy techniques can help choose the best approach for each client and each difficulty, because not everything will work the same way with all clients. From a CBS RFT perspective, we can approach therapy as a succession of moves made by the therapist to alter the context and thereby transform the function of variables influencing the client's responses. But the therapist can't just alter the context and assume that the function he is targeting will necessarily be transformed as hoped. Instead, he needs to watch the result of his intervention moment by moment and over time. This process works like a routine for the therapist using this framework. Step 1, altering the context. Step 2, assessing the transformation of function moment by moment and over time. Step 3, if no transformation has occurred, or if an inadequate function is dominant, repeating step 1, which is altering the context in a new way, or continuing with the same approach if what is needed is more time or efforts in the same direction. My last point about the overarching strategy of therapy based on CBS and RFT is about making sure that the ways we alter the context are compatible with the principles guiding the use of language. The first point is straightforward. When shaping clients' thinking, we need to remember that thinking is a behavior influenced by the context, and thus we need to alter the context to change thinking. The second point is slightly trickier. We could in theory alter the context by removing or replacing pieces of the context. That's what we do in contingency management, in institution, or when working with parents, because we have direct access to the contingencies. However, in the psychotherapy room, the context is for the most part made of the client's thoughts, and that can't be removed. Thus, when altering the influence that thoughts have on clients' responses, it's better to follow a cumulative and integrative approach. Note that some contingencies are more directly malleable and can be removed or replaced literally in psychotherapy. For example, if you notice that a certain posture or something you say has a problematic impact on the client's response, you can choose not to do this behavior anymore, thereby changing the context of the client's response. This approach is typical of what functional analytic psychotherapy does by managing the interpersonal contingencies involved in the therapeutic relationship. This is possible in the CBS RFT framework too, but we propose to add the language of the client as part of the clinically relevant behaviors to shape, because they are themselves elements of the context influencing the client's responses. And that part works better with a cumulative and integrative approach. Altering the context to transform functions need to be done in line with functional coherence, which means that the functions targeted by the therapist intervention need to be useful with regard to the client's goals. And finally, we encourage an experiential approach while altering the context to transform functions. It means that instead of telling clients what function they should attend to, as it is done in more directive approaches, we generally prefer evoking the observation of these functions and help them select which functions are most useful to them. Here is a summary of the main points you've learned in this tutorial and that I encourage you to remember. The overarching strategy of therapy based on CBS RFT is the alteration of the context to transform symbolic functions. Transforming a function means that a new function is added to an experience or that already existing functions are selected or augmented. Altering the context in psychotherapy is made mostly through language, since the context we can access in the therapy room is mainly what is said between clients and therapists. Altering the context to transform functions needs to be done in accordance with what we know about language and cognition from an RFT perspective. This is the end of this tutorial on the RFT CBS framework, focused on the overarching strategy of psychotherapy. So this tutorial was adapted from the third part of Chapter 3 in Mastering the Clinical Conversation, Language as Intervention. If you want to watch